Hello, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you, all the viewers. This is a class I generally give in Spanish, and it generally takes 2 hours, but this one will be limited to an hour. And it's looking at Orientalism in terms of art history and its legacy. Just so that you know, generally I do podcasts and I give online art history classes in Spanish and sometime in English. And you're more than welcome to contact me through the email that is listed here or through the webpage on WordPress. So let's proceed on Orientalism and its legacy, a theme that I think is very important these days. The way we will proceed will be first to look at the historical context, then try to define Orientalism based mainly on the definition given by Edward Said. What is this imaginary that they think about the Orient, the image of the native, and finally, the legacy of Orientalism today in art, in culture, and also in events. So the historical context, I shan't go over all the very small details, and if you want to look at it properly, you can stop the video at this time. But I just wanted to give a general image of what the world, quote unquote, looked like at the end of the 19th century. So you have the United States that had doubled in size. In Africa, of course, we had the scramble for Africa with the France taking control of Algeria, among other things. And of course, the very famous Berlin Conference in 1884-85, where France, Belgium, Portugal, and Germany divided among themselves the continent. You have the discovery of diamonds in 1867 in the south of Africa that made that scramble for Africa even more important. In Asia, you of course have the British Empire that is expanding, the French as well. Japan has been forced to open its doors, and in a frenetic way, it is modernizing. China, the foreign powers are encroaching very slowly, especially on all the big cities near the sea. And you have, importantly for us here, major oil discoveries. The first one in what was then Persia, which is today Iran, in 1908, the first substantial oil discovery. Then in Kirkuk in Iraq, and then Bahrain, and on the Arabian Peninsula all over the 20s, which kind of accelerated this idea of European powers being present. This, together with the Ottoman Empire, that is slowly kind of withering away, and its total dismemberment after World War I, and its division between Great Britain and France. Ottoman Empire, we have, as you know, extended from the Balkans, the entire Middle East as we know of it, all the way in the southern part of the Mediterranean. And around that time, in 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration, along with the British domination of Palestine with the Sèvres Treaty, where basically it was the idea of creating a land for the Jews in Europe, which was quite convenient for many governments in Europe. And as you know, the pogroms were going on against the Jewish population, and many of them did not, basically, their human rights were not very much respected. And here came this idea of a land with no people for people without a land, which is quite relevant for us because it's the idea that there's this land over there where there might be some people, but they're irrelevant. There's one thing I would like to say that is important. This big extension of colonies in Asia and Africa, there were three factors important that helped, in a way, the Europeans get that power. One is quinine, in the sense that with this medicine, they were able to go to some areas such as Southeast Asia, like the Dutch in Indonesia, and the heart of Africa, to use a literary term, because they could kind of survive in case of malaria. The second one was the development of light weapons. So if you have a lighter rifle, you're able to move faster and move in terrain that are not open, such as dense forests, etc. And a third thing, and that's quite important, is the unprecedented level of brutality that the Europeans used to conquer. And you can look at histories coming out of the time of the French in Algeria or in other places. And the local population was unable to respond with the same amount of brutality. And when I say brutality, I mean dissemination of the population, of whole villages, of whole areas in order to gain control of them. So why were the Europeans powers so eager to get colonies? Well, it's basically colonialism and imperialism. Here I put a definition where I try to fit in everything. So we shall read it, and it is political competition between European powers aimed at the economic exploitation of natural resources. So remember diamond, remember oil, needed for the Industrial Revolution and capitalist expansion. That's basically what it is. Upon that, there is a veneer of ethics. So the idea, the French called it la mission civilisatrice, the Anglo-Saxon world, the British, called it taking up the white man's burden. And here I've put two quotes, one from Fourier, who was a parliamentarian in France, and who says, sur toutes les côtes qu'elle visite, la France laisse des traces de lumière, meaning on all the shores that it visits, France leaves traces of light. And then you can read the quote by Kipling, which is, again, this idea that against this terror, and he uses the word threat of terror, with pride and an open speech. And it is for another's profit and a work and gain. So there is this idea of economic exploitation and capitalist expansion. But so this veneer is basically the idea that the white man has the burden to civilize the other. Because, of course, Western powers consider themselves civilized, educated, rich, hardworking, and very honest. Whereas everything else, and that includes Latin America, they're more akin to savages. They're not educated, whatever religion they might have, and that includes Judaism, Islam, Hinduism. These are pure superstitions. They're not Christians. Of course, they're darker. It's this idea that the other is darker. They don't have a past. And if they have a past, it's a long, long time ago. So it's Sumeria or it's, ancient Egypt. And since then, there's been no contribution to human civilization. They're also extremely lazy, poor, corrupt, and most of the time, violent and cruel. So you have this idea of this Oriental despotism where they need the white man to come and civilize them and teach them, to get dressed and to have a proper religion and to sit properly at the table and to speak their language and to kind of enter the world of civilization. So how can we with this in mind, how can we define Orientalism? And here I took the quotes directly from Edward Said's book, Orientalism, published in 1978. Edward Said was a Palestinian. He was born in Jerusalem in 1935. He was a professor of comparative literature at Columbia, and I'm honored to say that he was my teacher. And when he talks about Orientalism, he says is this idea, and you can read the quote, denuding the humanity of another culture, people, or geographical region. So you make abstraction or you take away what really defines the essence of a people, of a culture. And the idea, and that's interesting because we're looking at art, is that the European never gets involved. Like you will never have a painting with the European in the middle of quote unquote natives. He will always be watching. He's kind of detached. And he gets from that what Edouard Said calls a bizarre jouissance, which is kind of this pleasure that is a little bit uncanny. And of course, the Orient, as he says, becomes a living tableau of queerness. And I've put this painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, and we'll see many of his paintings. And this is actually the painting that Edouard Said chose for the cover of his book. Because you see here completely this living tableau of queerness. You have a young boy or a young girl, we don't know, nude, with the kind of a snake around that looks like a boa or something, which doesn't even exist in that part of the world. So he's or she is nude on a praying mat in a place that could be a mosque. Being blue, it could be more like Iran or Turkey. But anyway, these people have not really traveled there. And there's a bunch of men sitting, watching him. And then there's a flute player because you have to add the exotic. So this is a scene that one doesn't exist, and I can't even believe I have to say that it doesn't exist. Two, it's this idea of portraying the other, people from the Orient, and we will explain what it is in a minute, doing things that basically the West would never do. And it's totally ludicrous to think that a bunch of men would just sit around in a mosque, watch a naked boy with a snake. So they get, so this is a tableau of queerness completely, but they get a certain excitement from seeing that. Right. And what is the Orient? So what we will see is the Orient is really limited and it's just south of Europe. It's actually 30 kilometers from south of Spain. And it's mainly what is today Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, a little bit of Egypt, and a little bit maybe of this Middle East. But then again, everybody's the same, Arabs, Muslim, Turks, Persians. For them, it's just one whole bunch of people. Whether they're Christian or Jewish, it doesn't matter. They're just one bunch of people. So it's over generalization, if you want. So as we might understand it, in literature as well as in paintings, you have this idea. So here I've put just a few quotes of poems, and even from the title of the book or of the poems in the case of Lord Byron, you see, Les Orientales of Victor Hugo, or the Turkish Tales by Byron, or even Gustave Flaubert, who wrote the famous Madame Bovary. So in Salammbô, for instance, and I'll translate just a little bit, it's just this thing about Salammbô was kind of invaded by this softness and she lost all consciousness of herself. And he goes on about the fact that, clouds were lifted and she swooned on her bed among hairs of lion. I mean, totally out of his imagination. But this is one character from the Orient. That's how they are. And I put a painting of the Odalisque, and we will go into the Odalisque in detail a little bit further. So what are the themes of Oriental painting, Orientalist paintings? So the imaginary, and of course, the native. And you have a very clear example of Delacroix, of this painting or this aquarella, which is simply called An Arab on the Ground. In French is Un Arabe sur le sol, which means absolutely nothing, but he's there lying down in an environment that looks quite biblical. There's nothing, no construction. It's the desert, stone. There's kind of a horse in the back with someone, but he's just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So before we get into that, I put together this information. It took me quite some time to put it together. These are the main painters. So these are really the big painters of Orientalism, and then everybody else kind of imitated them or were their students. As you see, most of them were French. And so the idea that I wanted to say is, like, how many of them have been to the Orient? How many have been to Morocco or Egypt? So one of the most important painters of Orientalists, and we shall see it in the paintings, is of course Jean-Dominique Ingres, considered one of the greatest painters in the history of France. He has never, ever stepped outside, or he's never stepped, let's say, in Morocco or Algeria or any of these places. Eugène Delacroix, who's the other one, who painted an incredible amount of paintings. He did one trip, part of a diplomatic mission, where he spent 4 months between Spain, Algeria, and Morocco. And I'd just like to remind everyone that in 1832, there were no high-speed trains, meaning he must have spent a lot of these 4 months actually traveling on horseback, or on a boat to cross from Spain to Morocco or Algeria. So this is not, he did not spend that much time there, and certainly did not have much contact with, quote unquote, the natives, and we will get back to that. The other one is, of course, Chassériau, who was a student of Ingres and Delacroix, who only spent 3 months in Algeria. Jean-Léon Gérôme, which you will see many paintings of his. He only did 2 trips to Egypt, with during one of them a very short stay in Jerusalem and Damascus. Brigman, an American, who was a student of Gérôme in Paris. He did a few trips. Deutsch, who was French and Austrian. He did three trips, very short trips, and of course, Henri Matisse, who only spent 6 months in Morocco, 1912, 1913. And actually, he, in his biography or autobiography, when he speaks about his trip to Morocco, he says he spent 6 months, a little bit less actually, and he was highly frustrated. He arrived in Tangiers, and the first month it did not stop raining. So he was very depressed. So of course he painted his room and he painted the table with the chair. And he kept changing the colors of the table and the chair and the flowers and the curtain. And that's what he did for quite a while until finally it stopped raining and he could go out and admire the colors. But he only stayed 6 months. However, big museums around the world have held exhibits, enormous exhibits, called Matisse in Morocco, or even Eugène de la Croix en Orient, in the Orient, without any thought about this. These people really spend time. On the right, I put a painting of Chassériau, which is a scene in the Jewish neighborhood in Constantine. And if you will allow me, I will read what he says about his trip. So Chassériau, as it is written on the left, only spent 3 months in Algeria in 1946. That's it, nothing more. So he says, I have seen curious things, positive and overwhelming, tender and strange. In Constantine, one sees Arabs and Jews living as they lived at the beginning of the world. So it's this idea that these people have not developed any culture. Again, this idea of not being civilized. They lived like, I don't know, the time of Moses or something. And that's the idea that is brought back to Europe about these people that shall be colonized. So what are these paintings? What are Orientalist paintings? So first, the imaginary, yeah, this tableau of queerness, this Oriental dreams. And we will start with the odalisque because she is the one, or it is the painting that is most kind of relevant when you see Orientalist painting. And here it's, again, this idea of the sexual promise, as Edouard Said says. And, you come from gray London and gray Paris and gray Vienna. And, and it's Victorian times, it's rather stiff and people are dressed in black. And, you have manners and you sit in a certain way. And ladies are treated a certain way and they're looked at it in a certain way. So here you have these dreams of over sexuality with the odalisque. Odalisque, the word, comes from odalit, which is a Turkish word. Oda means room, and odalik is basically the woman that accompanies a man to bed, a sexual partner, if you want. One of the artistic inspiration is, of course, the Venus of Urbino by Tiziano from the 16th century. But here you have a typical example of the odalisque. Always a woman, generally completely naked, lying down, part of this nonchalance, with touches of exotic, quote unquote, details, the oranges, and of course there's luxury. So it's generally silk. It's things that are not readily available, I don't know, in Toulouse or Paris or Berlin. It's this dream about, it's together sumptuousness and eroticism and luxury, kind of this idea of how Rome must have been a long time ago, or Greece must have been a long time ago. So one of the most famous is, of course, the big odalisque of Ingres, which is at the Louvre. Aside from the fact that she's totally wrong, her breast shouldn't be where it is. Her back is way too long. So if she would stand up, I think her backside would touch the floor. Her legs are totally unmatched and completely crooked if she would put them straight. One arm is longer than the other one. Anyway, there are all these details that are kind of wrong in terms of perspective, but the painting is fabulous in terms of the details. I mean, you look at the silk, you look at the curtains, you look at the the feathers, the detail of the jewelry on her head. And of course, you have this luxury. No? So you need jewelry and the silk scarf, the way he paints the sheets. Ingres was an unbelievably, technically speaking, amazing painter. But this painting, which is really big, gives you an idea of this, the luxury and she's calling you, to her. And it's kind of, exciting to see women this way. Here you have other examples. So as we get to see, and I only gave a few, but here it's not, it's sensory, and sensory in the sense of, what you're touching, the silk, and the excitement, of course, and it's erotic delights. So these people have never traveled to this area of the world. They have no idea how women actually look like, but this is what they imagine, these women are. Even Renoir got into the picture. And this, the lady of Femme d'Algérie, is odalisque, is dressed, but she is inviting you in a way. I find this personally utterly vulgar. There's no beauty in this. The body of the woman, I find it not even beautiful. And especially the one by François Boucher, the brown colored odalisque. It's really to the edge of pornography. So, of course, you're going to imagine these places because you've never been there. And one of the two places you're going to be imagining is the harem. So you have this idea of this, despotic leader, sheikh, king, emir, whatever you want to call him, who has a harem with hundreds or maybe thousands of women who are just waiting to please him, to sexually please him. And this is quite enticing for your average French or British person. As I remember, we are Victorian times, and or a bit before and after. So they imagine these women in these harems, and I guess that's what they're supposed to do. First, they're naked all the time, of course. That's very important. And they spend their time dancing and taking care of themselves among themselves. Of course, these people have never had any access to the harem, and they have this idea that kind of remind us again of very ancient times, or what we might think ancient time were. And these women have no personality whatsoever. None of them is looked at as a mother or a sister or a wife. They're just these women, easy women, who spend their time naked, waiting for the prince to call upon them to give him sexual pleasures. Another forbidden imagined place is, of course, the bath. So now these images are totally ludicrous. The one on the left by Jérôme, both are by Jérôme, it looks like the shrine of a saint. A Moroccan or a Middle Eastern shrine or Muslim shrine of a saint, an awliya, but saint doesn't really translate the word properly, but basically somebody who is respected religiously and died. So they're going to build a small mausoleum for him, and it looks exactly like it. So imagine this inside a bath. Plus you have a carpet, which is crazy because, there's water in a bath. So and humidity, so you're not going to have a carpet. And on the right, again, it looks like the inside of a mosque, where you have writing on a wall that mean absolutely nothing. So this gentleman, he only spent 4 months traveling in the area and only in Algeria. So paints this. Again, the woman doing absolutely nothing, of course, naked, because that's the pleasure of the person looking at the painting, in a gallery in France or in Germany or somewhere in Europe, and looking into this place that is forbidden, and looking into the intimacy of these women. And the painter has imagined what they must be like, what they must be doing in those baths. Just to give you a small story, when Delacroix went to Algeria, he asked that he said he wanted to paint, to have access to the bath and paint women, naked women. And of course, people told him, no, it's not possible. Just imagine for 1 second that an Algerian man in 1850s goes to Paris and asks a Frenchman, I would like to paint your wife or your sister or woman in the bath. It sounds totally ludicrous, of course, but it's because the other is not seen the same way that Delacroix could actually ask the question, and he expected a yes, and he was extremely frustrated, which I think that's why he painted so many horses, because he had access to the horse. But this is basically the mentality within which People have gone to the area and painted that area, They have a right to actually violate the intimacy of these women because they are not really women in the civilized sense of the term. Now, Ingres, again, who's never traveled to the area, paints this very famous painting called the Turkish Bath. It's in the Louvre, along with the Lady of the Bath of Valpinçon. The one on the right is a beautiful painting, technically. Again, the way he paints the sheets. And if you look at the details of the scarf, again, her body just does not make sense in terms of proportion, but it's an amazing painting. But look at the Turkish Bath. So imagine you're a young girl. You go to school in Paris, and of course, one of your outings is going to be to go to the Louvre with the school. And because you go to a French school, you're going to go to the big area or the big room where they have the French painters, and you're going to see this. And this is maybe the one idea that you might have about these women and the way they are in that part of the world. I find this painting of Turkish Bath by Ingres extremely vulgar, extremely demeaning. The attitude of women, the way they're sitting, the way their body is. And be careful, I am not saying that these paintings should be taken out of museums. But what I'm saying is, as I put it in red, realize what you are seeing. If you love art and you love beauty, it is important to look at these paintings to understand how people viewed women or the native, in that part of the world. Okay, and how it influenced and justified many of the historical events that we've seen over the past 250 years or so, and that continue up to today. So just realize what you're seeing, and be conscious of what it means for how the painter painted, and you as a spectator, how you are receiving the painting and the impression it has on you. And especially if you don't know the Orient, and especially if there is ignorance. So unfortunately, there's a lot of ignorance in the world. And so since you bunch up all these people in the Orient together, you have the idea that that's the way it is. So these were women, and it's kind of the sexual pleasure related to that and sumptuousness. What about the native, especially man? So you have three general ideas that you see in paintings. First, of course, violence and cruelty. And here I put two paintings, one by Giraudet, the other one by Gros, about the event of Napoleon when he tried to invade Egypt. And it was a total catastrophe, and he had to kind of turn around with his troops, especially after the Battle of Abu Qir. So you see on the left, the revolt of Cairo is a specific event where the local population in Cairo revolted against the presence of French troops, which is normal. They invade your country, your city, you try to push the people out. Now, this is a representation. As you see, there's blood and chaos, and people are dressed in, they have turbans and dressed in silk, and there are people on the floor, and there are people dying, and you have the hussar, you have this French soldier with his spade coming in and trying to get rid of all this mess that there is, all this thing that is so uncivilized and violent and cruel. And on the right, you have a little bit of the same idea. So you have, again, this whole cruelty around and the violence and people dying. And of course, you have turbans. And again, you have silk and capes and colors and women that are naked and other people that are naked and on the floor and dying. And there's a lot of noise. But in the middle of all that, you have Napoleon Bonaparte on his white horse, the shining light of civilization, the one who came to civilize the people, the one who is orderly and disciplined and military and ethical and moral. There he is, shining his light. So you see here very much a contrast. The same way, as I said, Delacroix painted a lot of horses, but these two paintings, especially the one on the left, Combat of the Guren and Hassan, which is inspired by Oriental Tales of Lord Byron. The one on the left was actually presented in Senate or Parliament in France. And these are the kind of scenes that helped confirm the idea that we need to go there and colonize and civilize these people. Look how violent they are. So he made a lot of paintings called simply combat, where you have horses and men fighting among each other, as though that's the way. Maybe they didn't do that every day, but at least they did that. There's no reason for the combat. There's no idea of strategy. There's no idea of military discipline. There's no idea of why would they be fighting each other. Um, and of course, they're dressed in these, elegant silks again and turbans, with a total disregard for the health of the horse, which is impossible if you're an Arab because you will respect the horse, and disregard for life of the other. So there were many of these paintings called Combat by Delacroix and also by others. And of course, they have always been violent and cruel. These are paintings from the 19th century. However, they represent things that happened a long time ago. So on the left, you have the death of Sardanapal. Sardanapal was the last Assyrian king. So it's somebody who died, 7th century BC. So we're talking 2,700 years ago. And that's the way they represent his death. Well, he's very much alive on this painting, but we are assuming that eventually he will die. So there are these people around him. Of course, women naked. There we go again. And there's blood. And of course, he's on red sheets. And there's chaos. And we don't really know what's going on there. But anyway, it's a lot of violence, a lot of cruelty, and naked women. And on the right, you have a painting from 1870 by Henri Renaud. It's simply called Summary Execution During the Reign of the Moors in Granada. So they're going back a few centuries at the time of the Islamic presence or times of Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula. And this is what they imagine that people do. They simply cut the heads of people. It might echo some recent ideas. You simply cut the head of people on the steps of a mosque with blood flowing everywhere. And of course, you're dark. A Moor is supposed to be black, even though there were North Africans and most of them were not black. But it doesn't matter because you generalize and they're dark anyway. And they're strong and they're big and they're violent and they're barefoot. And they just decapitate someone on the steps of a mosque. That's the way they're seen. They have always been violent and cruel. And of course, they're fanatics. Remember, their religion, whether it be Islam or Judaism or their kind of Christianity, if you can remember the Crusades, it was a lot against the Eastern Church or Orthodox Church of the Middle East. Of course, they're fanatic. So you will represent some religious ceremony that you might or might not have seen in that way. And even the title, the Fanatics of Tangiers, you have no idea what this is. You have no idea if it's actually a religious procession or not, possibly the green flag, maybe it is, but you don't know what it is all about. So this is how they practice their religion. And of course, the Isawa ceremony, which is a Sufi ceremony, I won't go into details, in Morocco. Here again, you have this man, barefoot with a snake in his hand, and the head of the snake in the other, or some kind of instrument, going crazy. So that's part of their religion. This is how they behave. And here, be careful, I'm only putting a few paintings. I could have put much more that kind of retake this idea of the fanatic. But they're also gentle. So you do have the gentle savage, such as this painting by a Spanish painter, simply called The Native. So they are able to just be lying down, and not being cruel or fanatics or doing crazy things. So they might be approachable, even though we have no idea what this man is doing. We have no idea where he's from, but he has still his sword next to him. So they can be gentle. And I think one of the best examples of the gentle savage, if you want to call it that way, are these paintings, especially the one by Delacroix. But I will start with the one by this lady, Elizabeth Jericho Bauman, I think that's the way it's pronounced, of an Egyptian woman and her child. So this Egyptian woman is dressed like, I don't know, a time of pharaohs, I guess, not sure. She has actually, what is at the back? These are stones that you find in cemeteries. This is, to put the names of of the dead, very quite common across the Ottoman Empire. So if you don't know, you think it's just a stone, but anybody who knows she must be sitting, I don't know, maybe it's a cemetery, and she has a child. And look, the savage can be gentle and compassionate and motherly and take care of her child. And the same on the left. This is Eugène Delacroix, who this time, instead of taking somebody from Algeria or the north of Africa, took somebody from, Native Americans from the Mississippi River. So this again is this idea of the other, of the savage. And this is what he writes when he explains the painting. And he says, fleeing the massacre of their tribe, two young savages traveled up the Mississippi River. During the voyage, the woman was taken by pain of labor. The moment, meaning the moment of the painting, is that when the father holds the newborn in his hands and both regard him tenderly. Isn't that wonderful? So these savages are capable of being parents. And of course, the savage is naked and the woman, her breast will show. Because again, it's this lack of, unlike a woman walking the streets of Paris or, entering Buckingham Palace, these women, they go around half naked and their breasts in full view. So these savages can be cruel, violent, but also gentle. So now I just want to speak very briefly about this painting because it always makes me laugh. This is by Gérôme. This is one of the most famous painting of the Met in New York. And actually, they use that painting in one of their big books where it has something like, I think, the best of the collection of the Met or something like that. So it's called Bashi Bazouk. So let's say, you're European, late 19th century, you go see this in a gallery or in a museum. And first the name, Bashi Bazouk, that sounds like really Oriental, really exotic. Well, let me tell you, the Bashi Bazouk is a real word. And it was a very badly paid soldier of the Ottoman army. I mean, it was actually of the auxiliary army, meaning during a military campaign, if they didn't have enough soldiers, they would hire these Bashi Bazouk, pay them really bad. They were basically mercenaries, very badly paid. And most of them were either from Albania or the Caucasus. So in all probability, they were blonde, blue eyes. They were definitely not like this gentleman that we have in front of us. So they were very badly paid and they would fight. So let's look at this gentleman. First, he has a silk outfit. So he must be very well paid. And you don't go to battle with a silk outfit. He has weapons with parts that are made of ivory. He looks very dignified. He's beautiful looking. And he has a hat that God knows what that hat is. Basically, Jérôme put in all this idea of the exotic material that he thinks that people in the Orient wear, and little pom-poms and everything. It's a beautiful painting, technically, and the colors and the way it's done. But understand that it is demeaning for the people that he is painting. Right? It's like a total lack of respect for the local culture, the local identity of these people. It's really taking away their dignity because you take them and portray them the way you want them to be portrayed rather than the way they are. And this is what, as Edouard Said said, taking away the culture of a whole people and a whole geographical area in this case. So moving on, what is the legacy of Orientalism? And we will see four different concepts, if you allow me. But first, I wanted to put this quote of Elie Wiesel. And if you have never read his book, it's called The Night. It's a short book. It's available PDF on the internet. As you know, Elie Wiesel survived concentration camps. And with recent events happening in the world, I went back to read his book because I find it very profound and very inspiring, very sad also, but also there's a certain optimism in there's some light in the night, So in one of the passages, and I will quote him, he says, there no longer was any distinction between rich and poor, notables and the other. We were all people condemned to the same fate. And that's the idea, of course, when they rounded up all the Jews to take them to the camps. So suddenly, in this mass of people, you no longer have an identity. You're no longer an architect or an engineer or shopkeeper or a professor of theoretical physics. You're no longer a mother or a sister or a son or an uncle or a grandfather. Your dreams are all shattered. Your own perspective on life doesn't exist anymore. And you're looked at from the outside as just being this mass of people, all alike, stereotyped, and upon you is a generalization. So your identity, your dignity as an individual withers away. And this is what Elie Wiesel kind of explains. And you would see this is what happens also with the effect of Orientalism. So to start, I wanted to talk about this stripping the other of its cultural identity and historical roots. And I will take the symbol of the veil because it's also relevant for today, and especially the case of Algeria during the War of Independence. So, first, a small remark. On the right, you have a postcard. This was a postcard. And the breasts of the lady were not covered. So I looked through the internet to see if I could find the original picture, and I could. So I had to put this one where you see there's kind of a black mark on her breast. So imagine it was a picture of a lady with a veil, a certain typical kind of veil that you have in parts of Algeria, with the breast uncovered. So this mix of eroticism and the veil, which does not make sense. And the poster on the right, if you don't read French, it says, N'êtes-vous donc pas jolie? Dévoilez-vous. Aren't you pretty? Take off the veil, unveil yourself. Here, what is very important is that the veil became a symbol in Algeria, on one end from the French and also the local population. So the political purpose of, for instance, the postcard on the right is not just to satisfy this kind of European voyeurism of looking at breasts of quote unquote Oriental women, but it also breaking the resistance movement. And this is something that stays up to today when we look at the policy related to the veil, the simple head covering, hijab, in France today. So I quoted Frantz Fanon, and he says that the French administration was hence bent on destroying the originality of the people, because that's the way you can kind of take away their national identity and prevent them from resisting the French presence. So what they wanted was they aimed at a disintegration of whatever form of existence that could directly or indirectly allude to a national reality. So they had to concentrate their efforts on the veil. That's what they decided, because it was considered the symbol of the Algerian woman. All right. So, suddenly the veil becomes, if you wear the veil, you're not civilized. If you wear the veil, you're oppressed. If you wear the veil, you don't show your face. And it's interesting that a lot of women started wearing the veil as a resistance against this idea of taking their national identity away. So it was one way of resisting for them the French presence. And so first you strip the other of its cultural identity, but the veil is still kind of there. You still have this dream of what goes on behind the veil. So today, of course, you have this imaginary harem that was in the Oriental painting. Today, it translates straight away into sexual violence and this obsession, as we can see here, with feminine lingerie. And I put this quote, and of course, these are pictures of Israeli soldiers in Gaza. And they had no qualms about putting this on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and God knows what. And here, this lady, in this opinion that I really liked, she says, and I will quote, "The colonial robbery and pornographic incitement marks historical scenes of colonial unveiling, entering the colonial harem, lifting the veil from Muslim women's bodies and penetrating flesh." So it's like that painting we saw of Ingres about the Turkish bath. I apologize. So, you don't have access to this, because the woman has the hijab or is dressed, and suddenly you have the opportunity to touch that, to look behind the veil, to have this kind of sexual pleasures fulfilled just by being mean and violent and violating the private space of these women, because these women are not, they don't see them as mothers, sisters, daughters, wife. They are not known because they're behind this veil. So let's see what's behind it. And of course, you get sexual arousal out of there by demeaning, demeaning their private or their intimate space. So you have access to that imaginary harem and you display it, like a war trophy. And of course, the idea that they are a threat to Western civilization, which is a reminder of the colonial discourse. They are not civilized, we are. And this painting, again, by Jérôme, called The Slave Market, was used most recently, just a few years ago, by the ultra-right German political party, Alternative. So it was used, and I don't know what to say about this. I find this outrageous in terms of respect for the women of whatever nationality kind. It's just in terms of, displaying a naked woman where teeth are being checked and a bunch of, I guess, Orientals, Arabs, Muslims, whatever you might think they are. So this reinforces stereotypes and, of course, demeans and takes away the dignity of the people that are being represented. And it's, again, the other. The other does that. We don't. They do that. Look. And they're using art for that. And of course, this threat to Western civilization, you see it all across Hollywood and beyond. So here I've put just a few movies. Believe me, there are more. Where basically many of the Arabs or Muslims are portrayed as a fanatical and dangerous community. And I'd like to put, and I put a note, less than 15% of the Muslim world population is Arab. But there's such ignorance that, of course, everybody just puts together, as I say, Turks, Persians, Iranian, Afghans, Iraqis, Moroccans, whatever. It's all the same, right? And of course, Indonesian, people from Malaysia and everything, they all kind of get swapped in it if they're Muslim. So the idea in these movies is that Arabs and Muslims are stereotyped, many of them as terrorists or a threat to Western civilization. And this idea of war and terror thereby is needed. We need to fight them because they're bad people. And the idea is Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim. So that's the idea behind of all of these movies. So you always have one Muslim guy who's kind of nice, from, I don't know, from some Arab country because they tend to be Arabs, or they all portray them as Arabs. But the issue with the problem with this is that if all terrorists are Muslim, how do you know that the Muslim living next to you is not a terrorist? So it's kind of giving this idea of beware, be careful. And you have all the right to be afraid. And this is why we're conducting the war on terror. And you have all these movies that would prove to you that, your soldier, your whites, or whatever, your American soldier can go in and make peace in order for the country to stay safe. And one of the movies that most portrayed that is, of course, The Siege. The Siege came out in 1998, so it was before 9/11. And I urge you to see the movie if you haven't. It's basically this idea of martial law being imposed on New York and other places, and all Muslim being rounded up in camps away from, the rest of the population. So they continue to be fanatical and dangerous. And the idea of kind of one of the outcome of this is that because they are historically violent and cruel, you can dehumanize or there is this dehumanization of the other in the collective memory. And I will give you just this example. So you have this painting, which is in the Louvre, by Jérôme again, heads of a rebellious bey. Bey means kind of lord or head of a tribe. Anyway, in the Hassanain Mosque in Cairo, Hassanain Mosque being actually one of the most beautiful mosques in Cairo. And so you have two persons, one clearly not a soldier, but he's still sitting there on the steps, smoking his pipe very leisurely. The other one dressed like at the time of the Crusades, with a bunch of heads on the steps of a mosque, and some of them are hanging. So you see, they're cruel. They're not nice people. They're violent. This is what they do. So of course, when you have an Israeli media outlet that takes up the news that babies and toddlers were found decapitated, the great majority of people in the world never believed it. But the great majority of people in the West, in Europe, and in the United States did not even question the content of the news. When most people, it cannot be. They would never do that. Culturally, they wouldn't do that. Physically, they would, like it's not possible. They wouldn't do that. But the news stayed. And people still believe until today that it actually happened, which is unbelievable. But it's not that far from this painting. There is, in the collective memory, there is this idea of these people being cruel and violent. So of course they would do that. They're Arabs, they're Muslims, they do that all the time. No big deal. Okay. So this is, I think, one of these kind of legacy that we have to consider, at least in terms of the collective memory of how the Orient, quote unquote, is seen. And the Orient has become really Arabs, Muslims, and Muslims in general. So, of course, if they are cruel and violent, they deserve whatever comes upon them. So you have a total normalization of a violent occupation and a genocide that is being broadcasted live on every single little telephone, 24 hours. We know they're bombing hospitals and schools. We know they're snipers killing children. We know they're rounding up people. We know of the violence that is happening. We know children are dying of hunger. I mean, this is Palestine, the land of milk and honey. And this picture you see in the middle, it was taken after they had rounded up doctors from a hospital. And some of them are medical doctors, radiologists, surgeon, brain surgeon, cardiologist, whatever. And some of them, one of them is the director of the hospital, and he was actually identified by his wife. And that picture reminded me of the quote, or basically when I saw that picture, I was reminded of the quote of Elie Wiesel. So you dehumanize the other because he's violent and cruel and deserves to be treated this way. And you take away completely his identity as an individual. And you display it for all to see. And also, these would be the last, there are just three more and we're done. The idea that when you dehumanize, when you unculture, to use Edward Said's term, it's you take away whatever defines them as a culture. So you have the Westernization and appropriation of culture. And one of the most important example is, of course, sounds weird, de-Islamizing, I don't know, but basically taking away the Islamic component and secularizing the poetry of Rumi, Maulana Rumi, to suit this sort of American New Age, to get a vibe, and this secular West's search for meaning, or just to get a vibe, as I put. And this is not new. So I'm talking specifically about Maulana Rumi. I could speak about Hafiz and others. And you have all these books. I mean, they say Rumi is the best-selling poet in the US. But it's not Rumi that people are reading. People are reading Coleman Barks. And as you see on the right, he does not read, write, speak, nor understand Persian. And he says it himself, I don't have the Persian to consult. So his work is his own interpretation of Victorian translations. So in that kind of colonialist framework, people like Arbery and others translated Maulana Rumi, took away kind of its essence, and that was to please a public. And here I quote from this article that I put the picture of, a New Yorker, and I urge you to read it if you're interested. It's in the New Yorker article, they quote Professor Omid Safi, who's a professor at Duke University. And he says, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, it was in the Victorian period that readers in the West began to uncouple mystical poetry from its Islamic roots. Here, translators and theologians of the time could not reconcile their ideas about a desert religion with its unusual moral and legal codes and the works of poets like Rumi and Hafiz. All right. So remember, Persian poetry or mystical poetry in Islam, it's not just poetry the way you look at it in the West, with verses and rhymes and, and metaphors and beautiful ideas. It's really philosophy, and it's metaphysics. So instead of writing a dry philosophical text, some of them chose to use a mean that was as beautiful as the message they wanted to give. So they used poetry to express beautiful ideas. And what I did is I went around and tried to look at some parts of Maulana Rumi and how it has been translated by Coleman, but not even translated, interpreted based on Victorian translation. So I'll give you two very, very short examples, and I won't go into mystical Persian poetry. But for instance, Maulana Rumi writes, you say, with the body I am far, and with the heart I am the beloved. Now, in Persian mystical poetry, the beloved is God. And they use many words, ma'shuq, bararam, mahbub, yar, dost, dalbar. All these are words in Persian and Arabic to use. This is the beloved, and it is God. So the body is basically the physical, the material, the sensorial. I am, of course, very far from God. But with the heart, I am with the beloved. The way Coleman Barks writes it, the same verse, you say you have no sexual longing anymore. You're one with the one you love. Next, Maulana Rumi, again, another poem. I won't read it, but basically he talks about like beyond faith and unbelief, there's kind of this desert plain. And there you are beyond anything. And all you have is the knowledge of God. And once you reach this place, he writes, you prostrate in prayer. Okay. And in that place, there's not even anywhere because you are a knower of God. Okay. It's an extremely profound, these are very profound lines, and we can go for hours explaining what it is, but I limit myself. And the way Coleman Barks interprets that is, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, instead of using the Islamic terminology of prostrate, which is the act of putting your head against the ground in Islamic prayer. So he puts, when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other does not make any sense. Well, whatever he wrote doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it's Confucius to say, if you don't know the heart of words, you don't know the heart of man. And basically here, by disregarding the heart of words, they are disregarding the heart of an entire culture. But be careful, and there are two more slides. Ignorance and oversimplification is on all sides. Which is extraordinary is that, and I checked with Sotheby's and Christie's and looked at some of the auctions and some of the stuff that they were writing. 75% today, 75% of all Orientalist paintings are sold to the wider Islamic world, private collectors and public museums. And you see this one by Jérôme, Prayers at the Mosque, which is totally ludicrous because you in a mosque, I mean, look at the mosque, there's some Greek Corinthian columns at the back. People are not even in sync. You're supposed to be praying all together at the same time. Not some standing up and other ones. The one with his hand like that, I have no idea what he's doing, but still, it belongs to some museum or private collection. They don't say who they sold it to, and I wouldn't say it anyway. But it sold for 2.4 million euros, which is unbelievable. And this salesperson from Christie's, there was an exhibition in Dubai, and she says, most people, most Emirati collectors in this case, that's what she was talking about, they like expensive and beautiful things. They don't question the value of the paintings. And few collectors know art history, but they love the exotic nature of the works, and they talk about being able to feel the heat of the desert. Well, as far as I'm concerned, they could just get out of their air-conditioned environment and just go outside, and they would feel the heat of the desert. So there is also this ignorance on the part of the people buying the painting. So there's like a skewed view of themselves. It's unbelievable. It's like they're looking at themselves through the lens of the Orientalist. So it's kind of a self-reflection. It's like the mirror is giving us a completely different image, and they don't need to be expert in art history to realize that there's a skewed view of themselves by the Orientalist painter. And to finalize, I wanted to finalize with this. So as I said earlier, the local self, like self-perception is also distorted. And this is a photography by Lalla Saidi, who's Moroccan. And this one is at the Cleveland Museum of Art. She made a whole series called Les Femmes du Maroc, the Women of Morocco. And here it's like Rando Dalisque. So she retakes the famous painting by Ingres, puts it her own way, with all this writing done with henna, which is a traditional dye. And this is thereby her answer. But it's more questions than answers. So first with that, she questions the identity of women in the Islamic world and Arab world as such. And she questions the perception, like how do Arabs, Muslims, and foreigners perceive now this Arab woman behind the veil in the harem, offering herself or not? And she is trapped. She's trapped by stereotypes, and she's trapped by words, by facts. She's trapped by perception. Who is she? This is basically this is the way I see this painting. I don't know, this photography. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, or if this is what this artist wanted to portray, but this is the way I see it. No? So that's why she took this very famous Ingres painting and put it that way. So this is the last slide. And just to conclude, as I said earlier, these paintings should not be taken away from museums or art gallery, or, people should not buy them, please go ahead, spend your money however you want. But one has to realize what they're seeing, what it means, and the legacy up to today of, with the stereotyping and the generalizing. And I think these paintings are useful to look at, to learn how things can go terribly wrong when you deny the dignity of others. So I thank you very much for your presence, for listening. Please don't hesitate to comment, and don't hesitate to contact me in the email that is written on the first page. Thank you so much.